The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as Queen Camilla walked through the royal gardens, her phone pressed against her ear. She was speaking with her sister Annabel, making arrangements for the upcoming family gathering that had become a cherished tradition since her marriage to King Charles. For years, Camilla had successfully balanced her royal duties with maintaining close ties to her birth family, the Parkers and the Shands. The conversation was warm and familiar, filled with discussions about her grandchildren's school performances and her brother Mark's recent promotion at his law firm. These family connections had always been Camilla's anchor, keeping her grounded despite the overwhelming responsibilities that came with being queen consort. She had worked tirelessly to integrate her relatives into royal occasions when appropriate, always being careful to respect protocol while honoring her family bonds. As she ended the call, Camilla noticed an unusual tension in the castle atmosphere. Staff members seemed more formal than usual, their eyes avoiding direct contact. The head butler, normally warm and conversational, had been particularly reserved during the morning briefing. Something was shifting in the carefully orchestrated world of the monarchy, though Camilla couldn't yet identify what. Later that afternoon, she joined King Charles in his private study for their daily discussion of royal business. The room, lined with leather-bound books and family portraits, had always been their sanctuary for honest conversation. Charles sat behind his mahogany desk, his expression more serious than she had seen in months. He gestured for her to take the chair across from him, his movements deliberate and measured. "Camilla, we need to discuss some changes regarding your family's involvement in royal functions," Charles began, his voice carrying an unfamiliar formality. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, immediately shifting the comfortable atmosphere they had cultivated over decades of partnership. Camilla felt her heart rate quicken, sensing that whatever was coming would fundamentally alter the delicate balance she had maintained between her two worlds. The afternoon light filtering through. The tall windows seemed to dim as Charles continued, his hands clasped tightly on the desk surface. There have been concerns raised by senior advisors about maintaining appropriate boundaries between the crown and extended family connections. His words were carefully chosen, diplomatic yet firm, carrying the weight of institutional pressure rather than personal desire. Camilla's mind raced through recent events, searching for any incident that might have triggered this conversation. Her family had always been respectful, understanding the unique position she held. They had never sought publicity or advantage from their connection to the royal family. If anything, they had been remarkably discreet, often declining invitations, to avoid any appearance of impropriety. "What specific concerns, Charles?" she asked, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. "My family has always respected the boundaries we've established. They understand their role and have never overstepped." She thought of her children, Tom and Laura, who had gracefully navigated their unique position as stepchildren to the king, and her siblings who had supported her through every challenge. Charles shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "It's not about their behavior, darling. It's about perception and the need to maintain clear distinctions between official royal family and extended connections. The advisors believe that continued close association could create confusion about lines of succession and official representation." The explanation felt hollow to Camilla, who had spent years carefully managing these very concerns. She had established clear protocols with her family, ensuring they understood when they were acting in personal capacity versus any official connection to the crown. The success of these arrangements had been one of her proudest achievements as queen consort. As the conversation continued, Camilla realized this was not a discussion, but a decision that had already been made. The institutional machinery of the monarchy had determined that her family connections represented a liability that needed to be managed through distance and formal separation. The personal cost of this decision seemed secondary to the perceived institutional benefit. The weight of royal duty, which she had carried with grace for so many years, suddenly felt crushing. She had sacrificed much for her role, but the prospect of sacrificing her family relationships felt like losing a fundamental part of herself. The woman who had stood beside Charles through his most challenging moments now faced her own defining test of loyalty and identity. The following morning brought an emergency meeting in the castle's formal conference room, a space reserved for the most serious royal business. Senior advisors, private secretaries, and constitutional experts filled the polished table, their faces grave with the weight of institutional concern. Camilla entered the room feeling like a defendant rather than the queen consort, her usual confidence shaken by the previous day's conversation with Charles. Sir Clive Alderton, the king's private secretary, led the presentation with charts and documents that painted her family relationships as potential constitutional risks. "Your Majesty," he addressed Camilla with cool formality, "recent analysis suggests that continued close association with your birth family creates unnecessary complications for the monarchy's public image and constitutional clarity." The evidence presented felt clinical and detached from the human reality of family bonds. Photographs of her relatives at royal events were analyzed for their potential to confuse public understanding of official royal status. Letters and communications were scrutinized for any language that might suggest inappropriate familiarity with state matters. Every gesture of inclusion she had made over the years was now reframed as a potential security or protocol breach. Camilla listened in growing disbelief as her family members were discussed like political problems to be solved rather than beloved relatives who had supported her through decades of public scrutiny. Her sister Annabelle, who had been her closest confidant through the difficult early years of her relationship with Charles, was now characterized as a potential source of media leaks, despite never having spoken publicly about royal matters. "These recommendations come from the highest levels of government," another advisor explained, sliding a document across the table. "The Prime Minister's office has expressed concerns about maintaining clear lines of constitutional authority. There can be no ambiguity about who speaks for the crown and who represents official royal positions." The formality of the language couldn't disguise what was essentially an ultimatum: choose between her family relationships and her royal role. The advisors spoke of precedent and constitutional necessity, but Camilla recognized the deeper political currents at work. Her successful integration of personal relationships into royal life had been seen as a threat to traditional hierarchies and institutional control. Charles sat silently through most of the presentation, his discomfort evident, but his position clear. He had chosen institutional stability over personal loyalty, a decision that spoke volumes about the pressures he faced as a relatively new monarch still establishing his authority. The man who had fought the establishment for decades to marry her was now allowing that same establishment to dictate the terms of their family life. "What exactly are you proposing?" Camilla asked, her voice cutting through the diplomatic language and procedural discussions. She needed to understand the full scope of what was being demanded, even as she suspected the answer would be devastating. Sir Clive cleared his throat, consulting his notes before delivering the verdict. "Effective immediately, your birth family. Members will no longer be invited to official royal functions. Personal contact should be limited and monitored through appropriate channels. Public appearances together should cease, and any business or charitable connections should be formally severed." The words hit Camilla like physical blows. These weren't just administrative changes, but the systematic dismantling of relationships that had sustained her through the most challenging period of her life. Her family had been her refuge during the years of public hostility, their unwavering support enabling her to fulfill her royal duties with grace and dignity. "This is about more than protocol," she said, her composure beginning to crack. "You're asking me to abandon the people who stood by me when the entire country seemed against me. These are the people who made it possible for me to serve the crown with strength and stability." The advisors exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional dimension of their recommendations. They had approached this as a technical, problem requiring administrative solutions. But Camilla's response reminded them they were dealing with fundamental human relationships that couldn't be easily compartmentalized or controlled. "Your Majesty," Sir Clive replied, "we understand this is difficult, but the long-term stability of the monarchy requires these adjustments. Personal sacrifice has always been part of royal service." As the meeting concluded, Camilla realized she was facing the most profound crisis of her royal tenure. The institution she had served faithfully for decades was now demanding a level of personal sacrifice that felt like a betrayal of everything she valued most. The choice between duty and family, which she had hoped never to face, was now unavoidable and immediate. That evening, Camilla found herself pacing the corridors of Windsor Castle, her mind churning with the impossible decision she faced. The familiar surroundings that had once brought comfort now felt like an elegant prison, every portrait and tapestry a reminder of the institutional weight pressing down upon her personal life. She had always understood that royal duty required sacrifice, but nothing had prepared her for this level of personal devastation. She made her way to Charles's private apartments, determined to have one final conversation before the new restrictions took effect. The guards at his door nodded respectfully, but she noticed their expressions were more formal than usual. Word of the morning's meeting had clearly spread through the castle's staff, creating an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty that permeated every interaction. Charles was in his sitting room reviewing state papers by lamplight. When he looked up and saw her expression, he immediately set aside his work. The warmth in his eyes couldn't quite mask the weariness that had settled over him since becoming king. The crown that had been his life's ambition was proving to be a heavier burden than either of them had anticipated. "Camilla, darling, I know this is incredibly difficult," he began, rising to embrace her. But she stepped back, needing distance to maintain her composure for what she had to say. The physical space between them seemed to represent the growing emotional chasm created by the institutional demands of their roles. "Charles, I need you to understand what you're asking of me," she said, her voice trembling with controlled emotion. "My family isn't just a collection of relatives who happen to share my blood. They are the people who held me together when the press was destroying me daily. They are the ones who taught your grandchildren to be proud of who they are despite the complications of our blended family." She moved to the window overlooking the castle grounds, her reflection in the glass showing a woman caught between two irreconcilable worlds. "When the entire country seemed to hate me for loving you, my sister Annabelle sat with me through sleepless nights, reminding me that I was worthy of happiness. When your sons struggled to accept me, my children showed them what loyalty and respect looked like in a blended family." Charles remained silent, understanding that she needed to express the full weight of what was being sacrificed. He had spent decades fighting for their right to be together, but now found himself in the position of having to choose between his wife's happiness and his duty as king. The irony was not lost on either of them. "Tom and Laura have never asked for special privileges or treatment," Camilla continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "They've carved out their own lives while supporting me unconditionally. They've endured scrutiny and speculation about their every move, all for the privilege of remaining close to their mother who happened to marry the king." The room fell quiet, except for the ticking of an antique clock, marking time in a life that suddenly felt divided into before and after this moment. Camilla turned from the window to face Charles directly, needing him to see the full impact of the decision he was supporting. "My grandchildren will grow up wondering why Granny suddenly disappeared from their lives," she said, her composure finally beginning to crack. "How do I explain to a 7-year-old that constitutional protocol is more important than family love? How do I tell my brother that his success in business is now a liability because it might confuse people about royal connections?" Charles moved toward her, reaching out to bridge the distance between them. "The advisors say this is temporary, that once the new protocols are established and understood, we can gradually restore some family connections under appropriate guidelines. Do you believe that, Charles? Camilla asked, her eyes searching his face for honesty. Or are you telling me what you think I need to hear to make this bearable? Because I've been in this family long enough to know that temporary restrictions have a way of becoming permanent policies. The question hung between them, highlighting the fundamental tension between personal relationships and institutional demands that had always existed in royal life but had never before felt so personally devastating. Charles's silence was answer enough, confirming Camilla's suspicion that this separation was likely to be permanent rather than temporary. "I've given everything to this role," she whispered, her voice breaking despite her efforts to remain strong. "I've endured decades of public hatred, transformed myself into the queen this country needed, and supported you through every challenge of your reign. But this feels like it's asking for my soul." The weight of institutional duty that had once felt noble and purposeful now seemed cruel and unnecessary. Camilla realized she was facing a choice that would define not just her remaining years as queen consort, but her fundamental sense of self and identity. The woman who had found strength in family connections was being asked to sever those very bonds in service of an institution that suddenly felt cold and unforgiving. The next morning arrived with the efficiency of royal bureaucracy in motion. Camilla's private secretary delivered a revised schedule that told the story of her new reality more clearly than any formal announcement could. Her sister's name had been removed from upcoming events, her children's invitations to family gatherings had been quietly canceled, and even her weekly lunch with her grandchildren had been replaced with a formal state dinner preparation. Standing in her dressing room, surrounded by the elegant gowns and jewelry that marked her royal status, Camilla felt the full weight of her isolation. The tiaras and formal wear that had once made her feel empowered now seemed like costume pieces for a role that was consuming her identity. She had become queen consort, but at the cost of becoming a stranger to herself. Her lady-in-waiting, Sarah, approached with careful formality. "Your Majesty, the King's office has requested that any personal communications with family members be routed through official channels for review." The young woman's discomfort was evident as she delivered this message, understanding that she was essentially informing the Queen that her phone calls would now be monitored. "Even my conversations with my own children?" Camilla asked, though she already knew the answer. The systematic nature of the restrictions was becoming clear, designed to create complete separation between her royal role and her personal relationships. Every connection that had once brought her joy was now being treated as a potential security risk. The morning's schedule included a ceremonial inspection of the Queen's Guard, a routine duty that usually brought Camilla satisfaction in its traditional pageantry. As she made her way to the castle courtyard, she noticed the guard's expressions were more solemn than usual. The news of the family restrictions had spread through royal circles, creating an atmosphere of sympathy mixed with professional discretion. Standing before the assembled guards in their immaculate red uniforms, Camilla felt a sudden disconnect from the ceremony. These men had sworn to protect the crown, but she wondered if anyone had sworn to protect the human being who wore it. The formal salutes and practiced movements felt hollow as she struggled to maintain her composure while her personal world collapsed around her. During the inspection, her phone buzzed with a message from her daughter Laura. The text was simple but devastating. "Mum, the children are asking why you can't come to Emma's school play anymore. What should I tell them?" The question struck at the heart of what made this sacrifice so unbearable, the innocent casualties of institutional politics. Camilla's hands began to tremble as she read the message, the enormity of what she was losing finally breaking through her carefully maintained royal composure. These weren't abstract family connections being severed, but real relationships with people who loved her unconditionally. Her granddaughter Emma had been practicing her lines for weeks, excited to perform for Granny Camilla, the head of the Hay. Queen's Guard noticed her distress and quietly signaled for the ceremony to continue without requiring her active participation. The guards, trained to maintain protocol regardless of circumstances, continued their formation changes while discreetly allowing their queen the moment she needed to gather herself. As tears began to well in her eyes, Camilla realized she was facing a choice between her sanity and her duty. The institutional machinery that had demanded these sacrifices had not considered the psychological cost of complete family separation. They had treated human relationships like policy problems to be solved, rather than fundamental needs to be balanced. "Your Majesty," the guard captain whispered respectfully, "perhaps we should move to a more private location." His concern was genuine, recognizing that the Queen was experiencing a personal crisis that required discretion and compassion, rather than public scrutiny. But Camilla found herself unable to move, overwhelmed by the cascade of losses she was expected to absorb silently. The playground laughter of grandchildren she might not see grow up, the sisterly conversations that had sustained her through dark periods, the family traditions that had given meaning to her life beyond royal duty, all of it was being stripped away in the name of constitutional clarity. The guards remained at attention, their professional training preventing them from reacting to their queen's emotional breakdown, but their eyes showed understanding and sympathy. These men, who had devoted their lives to service, recognized the human cost of duty in a way that the royal advisors seemed incapable of comprehending. Standing in the castle courtyard, surrounded by the symbols of royal power and tradition, Camilla finally understood that she had reached her breaking point. The strength that had carried her through decades of public scrutiny was finally exhausted by the demand to sacrifice the very relationships that had made that strength possible. The queen consort was discovering that even she had limits to what could be endured in service of the crown. The dam finally burst during what should have been a routine afternoon engagement. Camilla was scheduled to visit a children's hospital, an event she typically approached with genuine enthusiasm and warmth. But as she walked through the pediatric ward, surrounded by young patients and their devoted families, the contrast with her own forced separation became unbearable. A little girl named Sophie, no older than her granddaughter Emma, approached with a drawing she had made especially for the Queen. The crayon artwork depicted a family holding hands under a rainbow, with "For the Queen who loves her family," written in careful child's handwriting. The innocent gesture, meant as a gift of love, struck Camilla like a physical blow. "My mummy says you're very important," Sophie said with the directness that only children possess. "But I drew your family too because important people need families to love them." The child's wisdom, delivered without any understanding of its devastating relevance, nearly brought Camilla to her knees. She accepted the drawing with trembling hands, managing to thank Sophie before excusing herself to a private bathroom where she finally allowed the tears to flow freely. The months of accumulated grief and anger poured out in silent sobs as she gripped the bathroom sink, staring at her reflection and wondering how she had become a prisoner of her own success. Her protection officer, stationed outside the door, recognized the signs of someone reaching their emotional limit. These professionals had seen royals face various crises, but this felt different, more personal and devastating than typical political or media challenges. The institutional response to family relationships was creating human casualties that no protocol had anticipated. When Camilla emerged, her makeup carefully reapplied but her eyes still showing traces of tears, she found Charles waiting in the hospital corridor. He had been alerted to her distress and had immediately canceled his own engagements to provide support. The sight of him brought fresh waves of emotion, but also anger at his role in creating this impossible situation. "Camilla, we need to talk," he said gently, guiding her toward a private room the hospital had provided. The space, meant for difficult family conversations about medical conditions, now served as the setting for a royal marriage crisis that threatened to overshadow any constitutional concerns the advisors had raised. "I can't do this anymore, Charles," she said, her voice raw with emotion. "I can't pretend that serving the crown is worth losing everything that makes life meaningful. You're asking me to become a hollow version of myself, going through royal motions while my heart breaks every single day." Charles looked older than she had ever seen him, the weight of kingship having aged him rapidly in the months since his coronation. "The advisors say that once the new boundaries are established, we can gradually restore some family connections under appropriate protocols." "Stop lying to me," Camilla said with sudden ferocity. "And stop lying to yourself. You know as well as I do that this is permanent. The institution that fought our marriage for decades has found a way to punish me for succeeding despite their opposition. They're systematically destroying everything that made me strong enough to serve effectively." The accusation hung in the air between them, giving voice to suspicions that had been growing since the restrictions were announced. The timing of these demands, coming after years of successful family integration, suggested motivations beyond constitutional necessity. Personal animosity and institutional control seemed to be driving decisions that were being presented as legal requirements. "What do you want me to do?" Charles asked, his voice breaking with the strain of being caught between his love for his wife and his duty as king. "I can't fight the entire constitutional system. I can't risk the stability of the monarchy for personal relationships, no matter how important they are to us." "Then you've already made your choice," Camilla replied, her voice quiet but filled with finality. "You're choosing the institution over the woman who made it possible for you to serve that institution with confidence and stability. You're sacrificing the relationships that sustained us both through the worst periods of our lives." The conversation continued with increasing intensity. Two people who had overcome enormous obstacles to be together now finding themselves pulled apart by the very institution they had hoped to serve together. The love that had survived decades of public scrutiny was being tested by demands that felt designed to break rather than strengthen their partnership. Outside the hospital room, the Royal Protection Team maintained their posts while being acutely aware that they were witnessing a crisis that could reshape the monarchy. These professionals, trained to protect royals from external threats, were helpless to defend against the internal pressures that were tearing their principles apart. As the argument reached its peak, Camilla realized she was fighting not just for her family relationships, but for her fundamental right to remain human while serving as queen consort. The institution that had demanded her transformation was now demanding her complete surrender, leaving her to wonder if any level of service would ever be enough to satisfy those who had never wanted her to succeed in the first place. The final confrontation took place in the very courtyard where Camilla had first felt her resolve cracking. This time, however, she stood before the Queen's guard with a different kind of determination. Word had spread through the castle that something significant was about to happen, creating an atmosphere of tense anticipation among staff and security personnel alike. Charles arrived with his private secretary and several senior advisors, their faces grim with the understanding that this meeting would determine not just family policy, but the future dynamics of the royal marriage. The institutional representatives who had pushed for these restrictions now found themselves face to face with the human consequences of their recommendations. "I've made my decision," Camilla announced, her voice carrying across the courtyard with surprising strength. The Queen's Guard maintained their positions, but their attention was clearly focused on their Queen's words. "I will not sacrifice my family relationships for the comfort of advisors who see human connections as administrative problems to be solved." The statement sent ripples of shock through the assembled group. Sir Clive Alderton stepped forward, his face pale with the realization that months of careful planning were about to unravel. "Your Majesty, surely we can find a compromise that respects both constitutional requirements and personal relationships. "The time for compromise has passed," Camilla replied, her years of diplomatic training evident in her measured delivery, despite the emotional turmoil underneath. "You asked me to choose between my duty to the crown and my love for my family. I choose both. If the institution cannot accommodate the basic human need for family connection, then perhaps the institution needs to change." Charles watched his wife with a mixture of admiration and terror, recognizing that she was taking a stand that could reshape royal protocol forever. The woman who had spent decades accommodating institutional demands was finally drawing a line that she would not cross, regardless of the consequences. "I will continue to serve as queen consort with the same dedication and professionalism I have always shown," Camilla continued, her eyes moving between the advisors and the guards who served as silent witnesses to this historic moment. "But I will also continue to be a mother, grandmother, sister, and daughter. If that creates confusion about royal hierarchy, then we need better public communication, not family separation." The guards, trained to remain impassive regardless of circumstances, found themselves struggling to maintain their composure as they witnessed their queen's emotional declaration. Several showed subtle signs of approval, having observed firsthand how family support had strengthened rather than weakened her ability to serve effectively. Tears began to flow down Camilla's cheeks as she addressed Charles directly. "I stood by you when the entire world said our love was wrong. I transformed myself into the queen this country needed, enduring decades of hatred and scrutiny. I supported you through your mother's death, your coronation, and every challenge of your early reign. But I will not allow fear and institutional politics to destroy the relationships that made all of that possible." The emotional weight of her words was evident to everyone present. This was not a tantrum or emotional outburst, but the carefully considered response of a woman who had finally reached her limit. The Queen's Guard, despite their training, were visibly moved by their sovereign's pain and determination. Charles stepped forward, his own eyes filled with tears as he realized the full cost of the institutional pressure he had allowed to drive policy. "Camilla, I never wanted it to come to this. I thought we could find a way to satisfy everyone's concerns while preserving what matters most to us both." "Some things cannot be satisfied through compromise, Charles," she replied, her voice gentle, but firm. "Family love is not a negotiable commodity. It cannot be rationed or regulated without destroying its essential nature. The advisors who recommended these restrictions don't understand that my family connections are not a weakness to be managed, but a strength that has enabled decades of successful service." The courtyard fell silent except for the sound of Camilla's quiet sobs, a powerful reminder that even queens are human beings with fundamental emotional needs. The guards maintained their positions, but their eyes showed understanding and respect for their queen's courage in defending her deepest values. In that moment, surrounded by the symbols of royal power and tradition, Camilla achieved something remarkable. She had stood up to the institutional machinery that had demanded her complete surrender, asserting her right to remain fully human while serving as queen consort. Her tears, witnessed by the loyal guards who had sworn to protect the crown, became a testament to the strength required to serve with both duty and authenticity. The resolution of this crisis would require weeks of careful negotiation and policy revision, but the fundamental principle had been established. The queen consort would serve the crown with unwavering dedication, but she would do so as a complete human being whose family relationships strengthened rather than compromised her ability to fulfill her royal role. The institution that had tried to diminish her had instead discovered the unbreakable strength of a woman who refused to sacrifice love for the illusion of constitutional purity.